both two so that I can present my screen?
Yes, Mr. Valencia, immediately. Good morning or afternoon. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Valencia. Is it okay now?
Yes, it's okay. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Hello, John. You can hear you. You can go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, our esteemed audience and speakers. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, we can hear you, John.
You are welcome to this highly anticipated Youth Alliance for Leadership and Development in Africa and the African Development Bank CSO-led session with a theme, Community-Based Initiatives and Climate Resilience, Success Stories and Best Practices. My name is John Bubuaba. I'm the West African Regional Associate of YALDA International, and it's my pleasure to present my co-moderator for today's event, Ms. Elizabeth Lua. Elizabeth, may you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Lua. Welcome on this session. I'm originally from Guinea, Conakry, which is in West Africa, and I'm the president of YALDA US. So it's my honor to co-moderate this session today.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the brief introduction. A few ground rules so that we are able to have a successful event today. So once you enter into the session, kindly be reminded to keep your mic muted, remain mute throughout the session, and ensure that your camera is off. Type your questions and comments in the chat box, and please remember to add your name and country. Those whose questions and comments are selected will be given the opportunity to speak. Once called upon to speak, kindly remember to unmute your mic and introduce yourself and speak. When called upon, kindly remember to repeat the question you've typed in the chat box. We have translators available for the session, and you can find the translation down the right-hand corner of your Zoom application.
Dear John, sorry, this is the IT person from African Development Bank. Can I ask, please, interpreters to start? Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Elizabeth, you want to proceed.
All right. Thank you, John. So as John mentioned before, today's session is a community-based initiative for climate resilience. And definitely we are going to share some success stories and best practices. So YALDA is organizing this side event in partnership with the African Development Bank for this 2022 CSO forum on the theme that John mentioned. So the objective of this session is to basically engage and harvest experiences and lessons from grassroots level organization and communities at the forefront of climate change in Africa, which lead to contribute to increasing Africa's voice and position in the United Nations Conference of Paris and Climate, COP27. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce all of our speakers, wonderful panelists. And I'm going to start with Mr. Chris Ayale. He's the founder and CEO of Kivu Green Corporation from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Valencia, can you show us?
Oui, bonjour à tout le monde. Et moi, je vais m'expliquer plus en français. Et moi, on m'appelle Chris Ayale, je suis le directeur fondateur de l'entreprise Kivu Green Corporation. Nous sommes basés en République démocratique du Congo, je suis congolais. Et notre entreprise est une entreprise qui propose des solutions numériques au secteur agricole. C'est-à-dire que notre mission est de digitaliser l'agriculture en RDC. Et actuellement, nous avons une plateforme qui permet aux petits producteurs d'avoir accès avoir accès au marché, mais aussi avoir accès aux informations agricoles. En disant informations agricoles, j'ai fait allusion à l'information sur les prix du marché, il y a la météo agricole, mais aussi les conseils par rapport à une agriculture durable et rentable face au changement climatique. Alors, c'est ça, nous, c'est ça qui vous gagne. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Chris Ayale, pour cette présentation. Et nous sommes ravis de vous avoir dans ce panel. Merci infiniment. Our next speaker is going to be Elizabeth Gulugulu, from the African Youth Initiative on Climate Change, and she's from Zimbabwe. And the next speaker, the next person on our panel is going to be Shanimoni Eribu, founder of Green Square Meter. He's the program director association for the Association for Research on Civil Society in Africa, and is from Nigeria. Our next one is going to be Kega Roger Nua. Can we show the picture? Perfect. And then he's a gender and climate justice advocate from the CAPA Cameroon. Welcome. We also have Natalie Sonia Mukundane. She's the executive chairperson for an African Youth Commission. She's also the YALDA East Africa Regional Associate from Uganda. We can go to the next one, which is Shafi Sani Lawali. He's the CEO of IPRIN from Niger. And our next one is going to be Jasmine Ben Miloud. She's the co-founder of WaterSec from Tunisia. And last but not least, we have Olumide Idowu, co-founder and CEO of ICCGI Africa, and he's from Nigeria. So welcome everyone. And John, you may proceed.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Once again, all our speakers, you are welcome to today's session. So at this point, we are going to begin our discussions. And so we have a general question for all our speakers. Can you remember that you have 5 minutes to respond to this question? So I will take this opportunity to read the question out to our speakers. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, Africa is regarded as the most vulnerable continent to climate change impacts because of its low adaptive capacity and overdependence on natural resource-based livelihoods. As key professionals and experts working in the space of climate change mitigation and adaptation, what are the key investment decisions and actions that are required by local communities, by governments, and by international community to improve the adaptive capacity of local communities in Africa? So all of our speakers will respond to this question, and can you remember that you have 5 minutes to respond to the questions. Thank you. Elizabeth, you may want to call the first speaker.
Yes. Now the first person I'm going to call to weigh in on this question is going to be Yasmin Ben-Miloud.
So Jasmine, can you unmute and speak?
Yasmin, are you on?
Min is on. You can
I
get
think
back
you
to her
are.
later. He's on mute.
Yasmin, can you please unmute? We cannot hear you.
All right. So for the sake of time, we may want to move to the second speaker whilst we sort out for Jasmine. So our second speaker is Olumide Idowu, co-founder and CEO of ICDI Africa, Nigeria. Kindly unmute and speak.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just quickly frame that conversation to suit where I'm actually coming. I'm from Nigeria, and if you look at the issue of investment and how we can improve local communities, in the context of my country, I think one of the biggest things is to understand that young people are the resourceful people that will actually move the economy and build an opportunity for themselves. And we also need to start looking at how can we start building critical skills in young people, and even in people that actually need food on their table and have access to social and economic opportunities. We also need to start looking at how can we actually improve access to water and sanitation, because it's very key for investment in a community, and that can actually improve a community that actually needs the opportunity to drive the economy for themselves. Another key thing we need to look at, and is very, very important for improvement of a community, is talking about strengthening the health system. The health system of people, the health system of the community is actually going to drive investment and is going to drive a sustainable atmosphere for everybody. So for how to improve or how to invest is something that we need to aim to create a vocational and build an employment that is just, so that young people can see it as an opportunity for them to take responsibility and to demand for accountability and accountability and transparency in the issue of development. So for me, I will end by saying that it is very, very important for us to create an atmosphere that is just, atmosphere that creates skills, atmosphere that increase improvement in job creation for young people, and atmosphere that strengthens community-driven action. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for those key issues you have raised. Elizabeth, we may want to check if our first speaker is on now.
All right. Can we have Jasmine on, please?
Hi.
Hi, welcome, Jasmine. I'm glad to have you back on.
Yes, thank you for having me. So I'm sorry I was disrupted for a while, so I didn't have the chance to read actually the question.
Okay, no problem. So the question is currently on the screen, but John, do you want me to read it or you want to read it?
Elizabeth,
I
go
will
ahead. And
maybe I would suggest, if it's fine with you, to ask the question to somebody else to not delay the session,
Okay.
and I can reply to another answer to another question maybe.
No problem. Okay. So yeah, this is the overall question. So all speakers are gonna weigh in on this question. So yeah, we are gonna move to the next speaker and then come back to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, that would be perfect.
Perfect. Thank you. So la prochaine personne que je vais appeler pour répondre à la question générale, ce sera Monsieur Shafi Sani Laouli du Niger.
Alors, bonjour à tous.
Bonjour.
Je suis ravi de vous joindre aujourd'hui sur cette thématique très importante qui cadre avec le développement de l'Afrique en général. Donc, je suis Sani Lola Shafi, je suis le CEO de l'entreprise Ipren. Ipren est une entreprise qui est spécialisée dans le développement de solutions technologiques basées, adaptées aux solutions agricoles. Donc, pour répondre à cette question, pour contextualiser la thématique précisément au Niger, où on vit dans une zone qui est vraiment aride, où la pluviométrie n'est pas garantie, la question du changement climatique est vraiment primordiale. Donc, je vis précisément dans un pays au Niger. Depuis des années, il y a des zones où la pluviométrie est devenue une denrée très rare, où tout juste au moins 100 mm de pluie par an dans des zones. Vous imaginez avec 100 mm de pluie, et comment est-ce que l'agriculture peut résister à 45 à 90 jours? Donc, ces questions, en fait, mènent la population dans une situation très critique de l'insécurité alimentaire. Qui parle de l'insécurité alimentaire parle de l'insécurité physique des personnes, parle de l'insécurité sanitaire des personnes, parle en même temps de l'insécurité éducative. Donc, au Sahel, précisément, dès qu'on parle du changement climatique, on voit l'aspect de l'insécurité parce que c'est le premier impact du changement climatique. Donc, d'après les analyses de la Banque africaine de développement, on atteint un rythme historique de 30 à 35 fois plus de rapidité en termes de, en termes de perte en terres de culture. Et ce sont 74% des populations en situation de pauvreté sont affectées par la dégradation des terres. Donc, en fait, cette question nous interpelle tous à trouver des solutions adaptées à notre environnement et de façon plus rapide. Donc, en tant qu'entrepreneur et professionnel de l'insécurité alimentaire, je suggérerais aux instances décisionnelles et différents États africains présents aujourd'hui sur ce forum de promouvoir des technologies de culture moderne praticables adoptées en milieu urbain et en milieu rural, telles que l'hydroponie, l'aquaponie, les cultures hors sol. Parce que ce type de culture, en fait, permettent de produire de façon plus rapide et de façon plus de rendement sur un terrain assez réduit. Donc, pour la population du Sahel, je préconiserais, je me dis qu'il serait impératif de former et d'amener les agriculteurs à pratiquer les techniques de RNA, de régénération assistée des terres, pour pouvoir réduire l'avancée de la désertification, mais surtout adopter nos terres à nos cultures. Il serait aussi important de développer des centres de recherche de stress hydrique en fonction des types de cultures, ce qui va permettre de connaître les besoins en eau de chaque culture, de pouvoir adopter par localisation géographique et par référence pluviométrique pour permettre une bonne productivité et plus abondante. Donc, la question de l'entrepreneuriat des jeunes est une clé pour la solution de développement. Donc, il faut promouvoir l'entrepreneuriat des jeunes basé sur les technologies agricoles, telles que la conception des équipements d'automatisation du secteur agricole. Et enfin, de travailler sur la digitalisation du secteur agricole, parce que cette méthode technologique permet en un temps record de connaître les informations relatives aux différents types de cultures, des informations relatives au stress, des informations relatives à la santé des sols, à la santé des plantes, et de permettre de prendre des mesures plus adaptées. Donc, pour conclure, je dirais, il est grand temps de faire adopter notre secteur agricole face au changement climatique et de faire de l'agriculture un secteur de développement et non un secteur de subsistance. Merci.
Merci
Hello.
beaucoup, Monsieur Chafissani. Merci infiniment pour votre participation. C'était vraiment brillant et vos idées sont vraiment merveilleuses. Merci beaucoup pour l'opinion que vous avez partagée avec nous. I just wanted to remind everyone that our panelists today speak French and English. So you might see some speakers only speaking French. So whenever you hear French, a speaker speaking French, please, you can refer to the interpretation, and the interpreters are doing wonderful. Thank you. John, you may ask on the next speaker.
Okay. Elizabeth, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So our next speaker is Natalie Sonia Mukandani. Natalia, you can unmute and speak.
All right, thank you so much. Can you hear me, John?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, okay. It's a pleasure to be invited to this distinguished panel to talk about a very pressing issue in today's world, especially to young people. And I'm honored and proud to be one of the voices that can contribute a thought to some of the issues that are affecting youth. And I know we all know this, but I just wanted us to start. Ooh, okay, all right. Sorry for that interruption. That's not my background, so maybe if we could kindly mute our microphones. All right. So we all know that climate change presents the single biggest threat to sustainable development everywhere. Its widespread and unprecedented impacts disproportionately burden the poorest and most vulnerable. Who are these poor and most vulnerable communities? We have women and we have young people. Why is it that we're saying climate change is a big deal? Most people don't understand that. But the reason why we're even having this discussion and trying to understand what we should do to combat this is because the impacts of climate change are expected to lead to substantial unemployment across the global economy, because half the global workforce is employed in 8 water and natural resource dependent industries. These are agriculture, forestry, fisheries, energy, resource-intensive manufacturing, recycling, building and transport. Now, we can imagine a scenario where over 1 billion people are employed in these industries, but now with the global warming and climate disruption, what is going to happen to these jobs? Or better yet, what is going to happen to the capacity of these jobs to take in the young, fresh graduates that are being churned out from the local economy? So from my interaction with young people, our organization deals with young people at grassroots levels. We are part of the African Activists for Climate Change. These are some of the things we feel would help combat the disruption of climate change. The first is investment in innovation. We feel like much that there is some innovation, there's still much more room for more innovations. More innovations around, first of all, policies, and then also technology that can combat the effects of climate change. Secondly, we're talking about green jobs. We need to sit down as stakeholders, as governments, as policy analysts, and see where are these green jobs, where can we place the young people? Even if these green jobs exist, are the young people that are being churned out educated and equipped enough to actually do these jobs satisfactorily? And then last but not least, we need to look at investment in research and development. Africa, being the youngest continent in the world as of now, has the biggest to lose in this global climate crisis, because 50 years from now, the young people we're seeing now are going to be in a position to have families, in a position to be able to build their own homes. But with the climate crisis going on, this is going to affect them greatly. So if we invest in research and development, especially in countries that are most likely to be affected by climate change, we can do what we call risk management and risk buffering, whereby we know that these countries are going to be affected by heavy rains, a lot of sunshine. So what can we do earlier on before these changes start happening? that will really, really go a long way in helping the young people of Africa not completely eliminate, because the crisis is here. We're now dealing with mitigation factors, but it would really help in buffering them. And, as we try to remove the carbon from the atmosphere. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for your participation. It was very insightful. All the amazing points that you mentioned. Thanks again for joining, and we are really honored to have you on the session. So our next speaker is also a French speaker. So I'm going to call on Chris Ayale. Je vais maintenant m'adresser à Monsieur Ayale Chris, afin que vous puissiez intervenir sur la question générale qui a été posée au-dessus.
Oui, merci beaucoup pour l'introduction. Et concernant pour la question générale, moi, je vais me baser plus surtout dans les secteurs agricoles, la numérisation, mais aussi je vais parler plus de notre pays, qui est actuellement pays solution de l'environnement, du climat. Et par rapport à ça, la RDC, si on peut parler du contexte national de la RDC, c'est un pays qui a au moins plus de 80 millions d'hectares de terres arables. On a plus de potentialités dans le secteur agricole, mais aussi c'est un pays qui est pays solution du climat par rapport à tout ce qui est diversité. Maintenant, au-delà de tout ça, la biodiversité est toujours menacée. Si une fois on n'essaie pas d'adapter l'agriculture par rapport au changement climatique, donc on va perdre notre biodiversité. C'est pourquoi j'appelle plus à la population, mais aussi aux innovateurs d'innover plus dans les secteurs de digitalisation pour essayer les petits producteurs d'augmenter leur productivité en utilisant de nouvelles méthodes et de nouvelles technologies pour aider les petits producteurs d'augmenter leur productivité, mais aussi de garder la biodiversité. C'est pourquoi, quand je parle de ça, je fais directement allusion à tout ce qu'on a actuellement. Les producteurs ont du mal à savoir ou à avoir la méthode de précision, et cela contribue à une faiblesse, à un faible revenu, où ça diminue le rendement agricole. Maintenant, si on essaie un peu de digitaliser le secteur agricole en apportant de nouvelles technologies, en apportant l'agriculture intelligente, mais aussi aider les petits producteurs à augmenter et à avoir de nouvelles connaissances par rapport à une agriculture durable et rentable face au changement climatique. Je pense que ça va aider plus le monde entier, parce que nous sommes dans un pays solution, donc on a toujours intérêt à garder tout ce qu'on a comme biodiversité, mais aussi à aider tout le monde à avoir plus d'informations par rapport à tout ce qui est surtout impact du changement climatique dans les secteurs agricoles. Parce que c'est l'agriculture qui est plus touchée, et c'est l'agriculture qui peut amener plus, qui peut diminuer l'effet de l'émission de gaz à effet de serre, c'est toujours l'agriculture. Donc là, on doit plus investir en apportant des solutions adaptées actuellement et en apportant plus de la nouvelle technologie dans les secteurs agricoles. En bref, c'est ça par rapport à cette question générale. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Ayale. C'est vrai que la RDC répond parfaitement à tout ce qui touche à la biodiversité en Afrique, le changement climatique, et votre intervention était vraiment brillante. Donc, merci d'avoir partagé ça avec nous.
All right. So thank you very much, Chris, for your response. Our next speaker is Kega Roger Noah from Cameroon.
Hello,
Please
good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Yes, I am Kega Roger Noah. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and thank our viewers and my fellow panelists for their contributions. But let me start by saying, climate change does not know gender. men, women, boys, and girls suffer, but women and girls suffer the most. But one of the interesting things I find with the conversation today around climate change adaptation is that most of these decisions are taken at the higher level, and these strategies are developed at the higher level, and they are pushed down to the communities to try to implement. Now, but the reality today is communities, rural communities on the front line of climate change, they want to choose their own adaptation strategies. They want to be part and lead the decision-making process when it comes to climate change adaptation. So communities have been facing these challenges for a long time, and they have been some kind of doing climate risks management. So for us to be able to move forward, communities really want to be part and lead their adaptation strategies because context changes with geographical location. So we are looking at how can we now support communities to get through all of this. Governments and organizations should be able to support community, choose their own adaptation strategy, give them the opportunity to try them and support them. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, but they can modify along the line as they move on in terms of implementation. Secondly, we have a lot of issues when it comes to land. Communities don't have access to land. There is a lot of rules and bureaucracy when it comes to land ownership. So you can't talk about moving agriculture forward or climate change adaptation strategies when you don't have access to land. Number three, we look at insurance. How can organizations and governments put in place insurance that permits communities to carry out their experimentation? They have these ideas, they have been using it at a smaller scale, but now how can governments put in place insurance policies that can be able to support this community as they try to push across their own experimentation in terms of their own local and contextual adaptation strategy? If there is a climate event, how do they fall back? We might think of also getting a universal basic income so that if they go ahead and they are trying to put across test their experimentation on adaptation strategies, they can have a fallback position. Finally, for us to be able to achieve adaptation, climate change adaptation, that is really meaningful, governments and organizations must fund community adaptation strategies. When you look at the current IPCC report, it says, yes, the house is on fire. We need to do something now. We need to hurry up. But yes, we can't hurry up like that without taking into consideration the voices and involvement of the local communities. Because if we do that, they will bring down these solutions. The solutions will not stick when the people who are implementing it are not involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roger Noah, for your intervention. I'm gonna call on the next panelist, which is Elizabeth Gulugulu from the African Youth Initiative on Climate Change. Elizabeth, are you on? You can just unmute and start speaking.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and can you see me as well?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the platform to speak. My name is Elizabeth Gulugulu from Zimbabwe. I work for an organization called African Youth Initiative on Climate Change. And thank you so much for the invitation. And I think about the question that was just raised, I think I just want to focus on more how, it's on adaptation, but how best can we try to improve our food security as we are practicing our agriculture in a changing environment, right? So I will start talking about, how how the agricultural sector itself has been contributing its own fair share to GHG emissions through unsustainable agricultural practices, but also is the most impacted sector when it comes to the effects of climate change. So there are a lot of practices that have been done over the years, for example, conservation agriculture, agroforestry, regenerative agriculture. But I'll just talk about the most common ones that climate smart agriculture and agroecological practices, because these are the most important ones, which will ensure that we have, at the end of the day, we achieve food security or we achieve food sovereignty. So when you look at climate smart agriculture, it has 3 pillars. Number 1 pillar is to make sure that we are reducing greenhouse gas emissions in all the activities that we are doing within our farm. So it could be when we are planting, what kind of machineries are we using, right? Even when we plant, how can we reduce the GHG emissions within that particular farm? The pesticides that we use, are they environmentally friendly, right? Then number 2, we are looking at how best can we adapt to these changes? How best can we adapt to the effects of climate change? In as much as we want to reduce the GHG emissions, but it is also important for us to understand that climate change is here and it's not going anywhere. And the effects are going to affect us either way. And we have to learn to cope with the changes that are happening. So as farmers, as policymakers in the space, how are we going to make sure that we are going to live with the effects of climate change as we are doing our farming practices? So this is where we are looking at how best we can introduce drought-tolerant crops, even the seeds themselves, right, to the farmers. How can we come up with water harvesting techniques within the farming space? How can we introduce like renewable energy within the farming space so that we can actually get to have access to water within the farming space, right? So this is some of the methods that can be used to adapt to these effects. There are a lot of things that I can mention about. And last but not least, we're looking at how can we ensure that at the end of the day, we have food in our stomachs. We are capable of putting food on our tables. We ensure household food security as well as national food security. So we're looking at how are we going to ensure that there is food at the end of the day, right? In most cases, some we practice farming because we want to feed our families, but in some cases, some farming is a business and they need money. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we ensure food security and we make sure that there is some sort of like income, some income for that particular farmer or for that particular household. So these are the 3 pillars of climate smart agriculture that we should be aware of, that us as young people can actually tap into to make sure that we are ensuring that there is food security at the end of the day. So if you hear people talking about conservation agriculture, agroforestry, all these small elements, they feed into climate smart agriculture at the end of the day. But now we have realized that yes, we do have climate smart agriculture, but at the end of the day, we do not want to import food. Because in most African countries, in as much as we have the land, we are still importing our foods, right? Which is not so good, which is not so cool, I can say. So this is now when the researchers are now saying, okay, fine, why can't we focus more on agroecological practices? And people will ask, why agroecological practices? Because these are totally different principles. So I'm just rounding up in 1 minute. So if we're looking at agroecological practices, I think the most important pillar on agroecological practices is to make sure that there are synergies between partners. So we're looking at the rural communities, how are they working with the NGOs? How are the NGOs working with the governments? And what I really like about agroecological practices is it has a component of accountability. It has a component of how we can best recycle our food waste at a particular farm. It has a component of making sure that is some sort of like diversity. We can grow our crops, we can practice livestock, we can practice poultry within the same piece of land, making sure that we can maximize food security in these changing environments. There are a lot of components that are there. I think there are 10 of them, but I'll just mention this few because I know my other colleagues will also touch a few on this. So this is all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisbeth, for your wonderful points you have made, including introduction of drought-tolerant seedlings and crops for farmers. I was touched by that also. You talked about renewable energy. Thank you very much for your time. So I think we'll move to the next speaker. All right, Elizabeth, we want to take over.
All right, so we'll have Mr. Shanimoni Eribo. Are you on? You can just unmute and start speaking. Mr. Eribo, we cannot hear you. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, hello everyone. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Great. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in Africa and the world. I'd like to begin, first of all, by thanking the organizers of this very important discussion, YALDA, and the African Development Bank, for putting this together. So very quickly, quite a bit has been said here by colleagues, so I just want to jump on top of some of the comments that have been made and then drill down a bit further, into a sector that I'm very passionate about within the climate change space, and also just to provide some very important comments, on some of these issues that we're discussing. So I'd like to just piggyback on what Kegan had said, about the role of communities, in developing solutions, to climate change. Now, as the word, the word that we're using here, adaptation, says, adaptation is adapting, to situations, adapting concepts, adapting solutions, adapting technologies, to the particular constraints within communities where we operate. So, I think it's very important to give communities agency, in the development of solutions, to climate change. And just as Kegan was saying, a lot of the time, what we find is that we are taking solutions, that have been generated elsewhere and trying to implement verbatim, as is in Africa. And obviously that causes disruptions. And I think it's very important to highlight, that communities, and people that operate within those communities are not totally helpless, are not without ideas, on how to generate solutions to the issue of climate change. And it's something that struck me, very early on, when I was studying my undergraduate degree, in property management, where I came across the definition of what land means to Africa, and there's a definition by a Ghanaian chief who said that land belongs to the living, the dead, and the host yet unborn. Yeah. Now, if you juxtapose that against the definition of sustainable development, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, you can see that they're practically saying the same thing. So the concept of sustainability is not new to Africans, and this is something that we need to bear in mind. We're not totally helpless. There's a lot of innovation and ideas and solutions that are inherent within our communities that we need to draw from, in order to respond to these challenges. And to just segue from that straight into the issue of solutions. So at this point, we need to be generating solutions that are inclusive, that are resilient, and that are green. Yeah, and if we look at the issue of agriculture, which has been talked about a lot, there's quite a lot that's been said about agriculture, but I want to talk about housing, which is another big issue in Africa, and which also has the potential to generate jobs, and create livelihoods for people. As you would know, the typical, construction project, a housing project, would employ at least 20 people, plumbers, electricians, masons. So it has a lot of potential, to generate jobs, and also to sort of drive economic growth. So what we need to be looking at is what role can the building, and the built environments play, the built environment professionals, who operate within that space, what role can they play in helping to adapt, the built environments, Africa's built environments, to these issues of climate change? And we need to look inward, So if you look at the conventional building practices that happen, across, Africa, so I'll speak about Nigeria, for instance, where I'm from, it takes about 9 months, to deliver typical housing projects. Yeah. And so if we go by that time frame, it will take almost hundreds of years, to meet some of the housing demands that we have. So if you look at Nigeria, for instance, we have a housing shortage of about 17 million homes, and unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be any developer, within Nigeria that can deliver 2,000, 3,000 homes in a year. So it means that, it will take us a very long time to meet, those housing needs. And so we need to then look inward at what were we doing previously, with housing in Africa, because, the big thing to bear in mind is that even though Africa is the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, we are not the greatest contributors to this problem, So in some way, it seems a bit unfair because we're bearing the brunt of the issue while not contributing a lot to it. And what does that tell you? So it tells you that Africa has been sustainable for a long time. We have not been, been negatively harming the environment. We know how to live in harmony with the environment. So we need to look inward, and say, what sort of solutions can we develop, in terms of our housing provision, that are in harmony with the environment, that reduce the, emissions of CO2, and that create jobs, and livelihoods for everyone, in our communities. So that's the little I just want to say there, about, looking inward about, for solutions, with particular respect to housing, and how we can use that to, to drive sustainable growth, in Africa. So I'll stop there for now and of course make further comments as the conversation continues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ribo, for your contribution. And I really like the fact that you pointed out the importance of giving the communities the opportunity to develop adaptive solutions and to limit disruption. That was very, very powerful. And I would like to recognize that. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So we will now, our next speaker is gonna be Jasmine. So Jasmine, please, I have your question here. Let me just go back to it. So, given your background, there are two key sources of livelihood in Africa, in Africa's local communities and farming and fisheries. And these two sources of livelihood are basically under severe pressure from global climate change, pushing a lot of communities into extreme poverty. And as an entrepreneur and climate change consultant, what do you think are practical adaptation initiatives that can be implemented in such communities to reduce poverty?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, to answer your question, let me take a few steps back and start with why is climate change disrupting this much farming and fishing? Well, farming and fisheries are very dependent on natural ecosystem that a slight change can disrupt entirely. So when we talk about temperature increase, long waves of heat, droughts, change in the rainfall patterns, ice melting, and ocean acidification, we are listing major changes. So the effect is completely enormous. We are here, of course, to discuss the solution and creative ideas to face these threats. So let's focus on that. Well, to start with practical adaptation initiative for farmers, we can talk about agroforestry. It consists in integrating trees and crops in a well-designed manner. In such system, every plant is selected for a purpose. Then we can rehabilitate degraded pastures, which is done conventionally with fertilizers, but can also be through planting native grass and trees. We also have integrated system, which means combining more than one type of production, either crops and livestock and forestry, crops and forestry, or all of them together. Recently, the World Resources Institute research showed that such practices account for many, many benefits, among which we have soil and water availability, attracting pollinators, improving biodiversity, reducing the impact of extreme weathers on crops and livestock, improving the productivity, and providing additional socioeconomic benefits by increasing the number of products farmers actually produce. Of course, these are only few examples, and many more practical initiatives can be put in place. Now about fisheries. As it is important to adopt new practices for farmers to sustain their livelihoods, it is also important for fisheries to improve their management practices to build resilience. Well, climate-related impact on fisheries can be either distributional change, productivity change, or species composition change. So practical good practices can be linked to one of these climate-related impacts on fisheries. Let's say, for example, enhancing monitoring programs through community-based approach, or applying flexible and adaptable fishing seasons, establishing early warning system for extreme events, or relocating fishery species to compensate for change in productivity. Such practices can be linked to one or more climate-related impacts on fishery, as I said before. And these practices are for sure needed to actually improve the resilience of the sector. I would really advise reading the FAO publication entitled Adaptive Management of Fisheries in Response to Climate Change. It has even more adaptive solution that will be really insightful to read. Overall, adaptation measures are essential to protect farmer and fishermen livelihoods, as they limit the impact of climate change effects. Nowadays, more and more adaptation initiatives are in place, but we are in need of more innovative approach and knowledge sharing initiatives to be able to secure the livelihood of as many farmers and fishermen as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmin, for your contribution, and yes, and for answering your specific question. So I'm gonna move to Mr. Chris Ayale for your specific question as well. For the audience, Chris Ayale is gonna answer in French, so be prepared to use the interpretation if you like to. If you don't speak French, I would say. So, Mr. Chris Ayale, this is your question. Africa needs appropriate business models to attract private sector investment in climate change adaptation. As an entrepreneur, and based on your experience in investing in climate resilience, what are the key challenges that should be addressed at community levels, and who should lead the process?
Oui, merci beaucoup pour cette question qui est vraiment dédiée à moi. Par rapport à cette question, je peux interpréter ça en français. Donc, je vais parler plus des défis qui empêchent qu'il y ait plus... L'Afrique a besoin d'un modèle commercial approprié pour attirer les investissements dans le secteur privé, dans le sens d'adaptation des changements climatiques. En se basant sur mon expérience, j'ai au moins identifié au moins cinq principaux défis qui empêchent qu'il y ait vraiment que les investisseurs ont du mal à avoir des modèles économiques, commerciaux pour venir investir en Afrique. Je vais commencer par le premier niveau, c'est le niveau éducationnel. Donc, on a constaté qu'au niveau éducationnel, ni les bénéficiaires, ni les entrepreneurs, beaucoup n'ont pas pris conscience de tout ce qui est danger du changement climatique et leur impact. Surtout du côté, je me base encore du secteur agricole, parce que c'est là où il y a beaucoup de personnes qui vivent grâce à l'agriculture. Les producteurs ne savent pas vraiment l'impact du changement climatique tant qu'ils n'ont pas encore vraiment vécu ça ou palpé de ça. Donc, par rapport à ça, donc je suggère directement, il faut qu'il y ait plus de sensibilisation par rapport à tout ce qui est danger du changement climatique et l'impact du changement climatique dans la vie sociale, dans la vie économique de tout un pays. Je pense que ça va aider même aux bénéficiaires, même si on apporte une solution par rapport au changement climatique, ils vont s'approprier directement de ça parce qu'ils savent déjà les dangers, c'est quoi. Ça, c'est un. Donc, on doit essayer de faire plus de sensibilisation, d'information par rapport à tout ce qui est impact négatif du changement climatique et les grands dangers par rapport à ça. Le deuxième niveau, on avait identifié que même les entrepreneurs, du côté entrepreneurs, eux aussi, ils ont du mal à trouver vraiment des modèles adaptés, modèles économiques, bien sûr, adaptés à tout ce qui est solution par rapport au changement climatique. Et ils pensent que les choses des climats, les choses des changements climatiques appartiennent seulement aux ONG. Donc, on a tendance à comprendre que tout ce qui est climat, c'est pour les ONG. Et pourtant, c'est quelque chose, nous, on peut modéliser ça, ça devient du business. On essaie un peu d'apporter des solutions par rapport au climat, mais aussi en essayant d'atténuer et d'apporter des solutions à tout ce qui est changement climatique. On crée l'emploi, on crée la richesse en résolvant les problèmes du changement climatique. Le troisième niveau, c'est le niveau qui est lié au niveau technique. Des fois, les solutions par rapport à tout ce qui est changement climatique, adaptation du changement climatique, ça implique beaucoup de technologies. Maintenant, ici, de notre niveau, surtout en Afrique, on a le problème d'avoir des main-d'œuvre qualifiées, mais aussi des outils à utiliser pour s'adapter à tout ce qui est à s'adapter ou à apporter des solutions qui cadrent avec tout ce qui est changement climatique. Je peux m'illustrer en donnant un exemple. Par exemple, si on essaie un peu d'introduire la technologie de l'intelligence, soit artificielle dans le secteur agricole, et tout ça, ça demande, on aura beaucoup de choses, des capteurs à mettre en place, des champs de production pour interpréter des climats, tout ça. Maintenant, du côté matériel, ça devient tout un problème. Et aussi les petits producteurs ou les acteurs du monde agricole n'ont pas vraiment des outils qui permettent, n'ont pas vraiment des outils qui permettent aux innovateurs d'introduire leurs solutions et leurs facilités à l'utiliser. Je peux dire qu'il y a d'autres solutions qui nécessitent vraiment, il faut que vous ayez un smartphone pour utiliser ça. Mais vous trouvez que les utilisateurs, la majorité n'ont pas des smartphones. Du coup, on est bloqué à apporter ce genre de solutions. Donc, on doit essayer d'outiller même les utilisateurs pour apporter des solutions qui sont adaptées par rapport au changement climatique. Le quatrième niveau, on a constaté que ici, en Afrique, on a vraiment, dans certaines régions, on a déjà des incubateurs, des accélérateurs, mais quand on essaie un peu d'analyser tout ce qu'on donne comme formation, comme modèle, on ne parle pas vraiment des solutions, comment on peut porter des solutions qui sont plus adaptées dans tout ce qui est changement climatique, des modèles d'affaires dans tout ce qui est changement climatique. Donc, du côté des structures d'accompagnement, des incubateurs, accélérateurs, on doit voir comment insérer ces modèles-là pour aider les entrepreneurs qui ont vraiment envie de s'y investir dans ces secteurs et apporter des solutions durables par rapport au changement climatique. Et je profite par là à suggérer directement si on peut voir comment on peut créer même des labs, parce que des labs agricoles. Donc, on voit les incubateurs, les accélérateurs, la majorité sont en ville. Si on essaie un peu de créer des labs, même dans les zones rurales, c'est là où il y a plus de problèmes. Les gens ignorent de tout ce qui est impact négatif du changement climatique dans leur secteur. On passe plus à la sorcellerie. Quand il n'y a pas de production, peut-être il y a des sorciers, tout ça, mais ce sont des impacts du changement climatique. Et cela ça va créer même des conflits dans tout un village. Mais en réalité, c'est le climat, vu qu'ils n'ont pas de connaissances par rapport aux caprices climatiques, ça crée des conflits suite au manque d'informations. Si on crée des labs agricoles qui sont vraiment basés dans les zones rurales, ça va aider plus à monter les connaissances par rapport à tout ce qui est impact négatif du changement climatique. Et du côté aussi, 5e niveau, du côté programme gouvernemental, jusque-là, du côté gouvernement, on a certains gouvernements en Afrique, ils ont déjà des programmes d'adaptation, mais jusque-là, du côté praticabilité, ça reste que des tests. Il n'y a pas de structures d'accompagnement, de vulgarisation, de tout ça. Ça aussi, ça freine même les entrepreneurs pour s'investir dans ce secteur, mais aussi, ça empêche aussi la population de comprendre l'impact et la menace de tout ce qui est changement climatique. Je pense que c'est à ce niveau-là que nous, on a essayé d'analyser parmi les défis qui empêchent qu'il y ait vraiment beaucoup des investisseurs qui peuvent trouver des bons modèles et s'investir dans les secteurs agricoles. dans tout ce qui est adaptation au changement climatique. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chris Ayale, for your brilliant contribution. And definitely you did mention very, very important points. And, going from people not being truly aware of the true impacts of climate change on the continent, and, suggesting that we should raise awareness so that a lot of people are basically educated on the impacts of climate change. You also suggested that we should introduce innovative solutions such as artificial intelligence in agriculture, have an adapted business model to our own reality, and have different programs led or funded by the government. So thank you very much. Donc, j'étais en train de dire, Monsieur Chris, merci infiniment pour les 5 niveaux d'analyse que vous avez brillamment représenté et vous avez brillamment défendu pendant cette session. C'était vraiment, vraiment intéressant et merci infiniment pour votre expertise.
Merci beaucoup.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth. Okay, so our next speaker is Elizabeth Gulugulu. As an advocate for grassroots youth, women, and persons with disabilities, and other displaced groups facing the impact of climate change, what are the major challenges that confront these groups in climate resilience, and what recommendations would you propose? Elizabeth, if you are there, can you unmute and speak? Elizabeth, please, are you on?
I don't think
Elizabeth.
I can see her on.
Yeah,
I don't think she's on.
Yes, I can't
She might be, she might be having internet issues. Okay. I don't know. But we can move on to the next one.
Yes,
you want me to go?
To the next. Yes,
we can go.
Can you go for the next speaker?
Okay. So our next speaker is going to be Mr. Eribo, and here is your question. At global level, adaptation and resilience are yet to gain the same prominence as mitigation, as global attention has largely been skewed towards mitigation, which receives 90% of global climate finance. Now, based on your experience as strategist and a fundraiser, how do you think national governments and local communities in Africa can raise more funding to invest in climate adaptation?
Thank you very much for that question, Elizabeth. So several dimensions, to this question. So first of all, fundraising is a very technical skill. You need to have some sort of, you need to have ability and competence, around fundraising, understand financial concepts, and how to go about it. But, the most important thing I would say in terms of contextualizing this question, so looking at what national and local governments can do, in order to be able to raise more climate financing, the first thing I would say, is to have the right leadership, in place, and I can give you a very, clear example, of how leadership can translate to success, in fundraising. As John Maxwell said, everything rises and falls on leadership. So if you look at the African Development Bank, for instance, as an example, you have very capable leadership at the top in the bank just now. And that has translated to something called the African Adaptation Accelerator Program, which was launched last year by Mr. Akewumi Adesina, which is a mechanism, that tries to increase, access to climate finance, for African governments, all across the continent. Now, the goal of that mechanism is to raise about $25 billion over the next 5 years, to implement projects across Africa around agriculture, infrastructure, youth empowerment. And there's also an important element, of that program that's been created by AfDB, which speaks to building capacity, which is the next item that I will speak about. So you start with leadership, but then that leadership needs to have competence and have the capacity, to be successful in fundraising. And so what you then find within national and local governments, in Africa, is that sometimes the competencies are not clearly matched, to the requirements of the roles. And so given the technicality of fundraising, you need to have the right people in place, so you need to have the right people driving fundraising who understand the concepts, who understand the terms. So for instance, if you look at, the flows, of climate finance to Africa for adaptation, we find that we're seeing more of that money come to Africa as loans rather than as grants. I'm not sure that would be the same in other parts, of the world. So it's just in terms of understanding these dynamics, and understanding that you need to position yourself a bit differently, when you're trying to access climate finance, can make some difference. And of course, when you're trying to access climate finance, there's usually a requirement, for counterpart funding. So if you look at the Africa Adaptation Accelerator Program created by AfDB, AfDB have positioned themselves by providing 12.5 billion of counterpart funding to another 12.5 billion that is coming from global investors. So understanding that requirements, takes you to the next component, the next element, of being ready, or being able to raise financing, which is planning, planning and coordination. Now, if you understand that there's usually a requirement for counterpart funding, for you to raise financing from global partners like, the UN, the World Bank, IFC, then within your national and local budgets, you must then begin to provision, for that counterpart funding so that you can be successful, in meeting the matching grant requirements, for accessing some of these opportunities. And so what often happens is when the right leadership is not in place, that doesn't have the right competence, that is not able to plan properly, you start to have problems, because then it then appears that you're not able to rise up, and meet the requirements to access these opportunities. And so I think, what I call the LCCC framework, leadership, competence, conviction, competence, and coordinating, so there has to be that coordination between national and local governments, as well as international entities like the AfDB, who are sort of leading the charge in trying to increase the flows of climate finance to Africa. And so when you don't have that sort of coordination, again, at the national and local level, you might be missing out on opportunities. And so if you then, move to the macro level, of what you need to be doing. So what are the mechanisms, what are the instruments that are available out there, for you to access climate finance? You can talk about things like green bonds. You can talk about things like resilience bonds. How do you then position your countries, to develop a pipeline of projects, that can then feed into these bonds, that can then be floated, maybe on some stock markets in Europe or America or whatever, so that you can then access the financing. There's been some success, with issuing green bonds in Nigeria, for instance. The Ministry of Environment in Nigeria has raised a number of green bonds that they've used to finance renewable energy projects. And also there are certain banks in Nigeria, like Access Bank, who've been floating green bonds recently to try to access capital, at cheaper interest rates to be able to finance projects in Nigeria. But for me personally, as a built environment professional, what I like to see is more green bonds and green finance going towards housing projects. Again, if you look at the structure of the Africa Adaptation Accelerator Program, there is some reference to infrastructure projects, but it doesn't say a lot about housing. It's not very explicit. It might be in there somewhere, but it's not explicit. This is the same thing that I've found, with Nigeria's NDCs, nationally determined contributions to, the Paris climate targets. There is some talk about energy efficiency, but it's not explicit enough to talk about housing, as a sector. And I think what is important for people to recognize is that at the Paris Climate Summit, of 2015, the built environment was recognized as the sector that can contribute the most to the achievement of the targets at the least cost. So I think it's a massive opportunity that we're missing there.
both from contribution from the perspective of contributing to meeting the targets, and also from the perspective of how this can drive economic growth, as I said earlier. So you need to be looking at how can investment in housing, which is a massive requirement. I mean, even in your farms, you're going to require some housing. You're going to require housing for the farmers who live there. You're going to require buildings, for storage, of goods, processing of goods, things like that. So you want to be looking at how you can be developing climate-friendly infrastructure within, farms, as well as, in cities, and rural areas. So for me, those are the key things to look out for, to make sure that we're able to increase financial flows to adaptation projects in Africa. Leadership, competency, conviction, coordination, planning, and then also being able to provide, a pipeline of bankable projects that this financing can go to, of course, most importantly, with consultation from communities. Communities must have an input into how these products are developed. And I think, once you have that sort of mixture, of having the right stakeholders involved in the process, then we should have some success. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ribo, for your contribution. To the audience, please kindly type any comments and questions for our speakers, and do not forget to mention your country as well. Your questions might be selected to be asked during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Right. So the next question goes to Kegaru Janua. Climate adaptation processes must be community-led, and prioritizing bottom-out decision-making and ownership of process in climate adaptation leads to a more impactful and resilient communities. Now, what kind of safe spaces are available and or should be created by local communities to enable them lead this process? Say your question. So can you unmute and speak?
Okay, John, thank you. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes. You see, communities, whether poor, indigenous, or rural, should always choose their own response to climate change because they often been doing it for a long time. You see, most of what we do, we tend to like, okay, we know better than this community. So we are bringing the solutions to them to enable or to save them. I can give you, there are rural communities in Cameroon that has never seen an NGO. There are rural communities in Cameroon that even they don't have agri-extension workers. So how do these people survive? Which means communities have been doing something. They are not helpless. I will give you an example of a climate justice project we implemented. One of the priority criteria we used was access to land. If the family, and we worked with farm families. We worked with over 1,000 farm families to support their adaptation journey. Now, we visited their farms, we sat with them, we discussed with them. We said, yes, previous year challenges, previous year harvest, what were your limitations and how could you do it better? Then we came out with an integrated farm plan where the voice of the wife is listened to, the voice of the children are listened to, and the husband. So all of them, they come out with a plan for that farm and they decide on what they will do with the harvest at the end. So at the end of the cropping period, we supported them with farm inputs like seeds and other equipments. But at the end of it, they were able to like, okay, say yes, we have achieved because we put into practice our knowledge in order to achieve this goal. So when they sold the produce, they bought dresses for their children, they changed from thatch houses and they were now living in corrugated iron sheet houses. Some of them bought their TVs and paid school fees, medical bills for their families. So what am I saying? Communities are not completely blank. If you are talking about adaptation and talking about sustainability, then the people who have to implement all of these adaptation strategies should be at the forefront of leading decisions that that will help them in their adaptation journey. Secondly, what we are looking at is governments need to work with these communities. Researchers need to work with these communities. Organizations need to work with these communities. Let them listen to the communities and see how they can create that opportunity for the communities to be able to lead their own adaptation strategy, make all the errors, propose the modifications, and move on. Secondly, I spoke about the insurance or a universal basic income scheme. Now, rural communities in Africa, especially Cameroon, they have this what you call village saving and loan association. Village saving and loan association, most of the time they come to save and they loan money. Now, we were able to identify a couple and we say, yes, you are only saving money, but can you think into production? You are mostly farmers. Can you look at working together in a form of a cooperative where you can be able to cultivate at a large scale and we are able to market those produce? So they got land, we went into maize cultivation and other crops and livestock, and their saving and loan scheme was functional. And successfully, we got a lot of produce from the farm. We were very successful. But in the case there was a climate event, the climate event might affect their production, but they have a fallback position, which is their saving. Their savings in the Village Saving and Loan Association is able to give them that opportunity where they can bounce back. But if we look at it as government coming to give an organization helping these people with insurance policies, that they can be able to experiment their own adaptation strategies, and in case there is a climate event, they are able to bounce back, then the voices of these community members are listened to. We have the third area where we have this issue of land, access to lands. We are Africans, but there is a conflict between national land and community land. We have the legal framework coming from the national level, we have the customary land rights. So you see all of this conflict in the legal system is affecting all of the work we are doing in terms of adaptation, because the community members, they don't have access and control over land. And finally, I will say community members need to be at the center of driving their own adaptation strategy. What organizations and governments need to do is to sit with these community members, listen to them, and fund their adaptation strategies. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Key points I noted from your submission is the fact that communities are not blank, and it's true, they have their own knowledge base, and so we need to work with communities and fund their own initiatives. You also talked about insurance, that you set an example of a savings and loan scheme for rural communities that they can fall on when there is an event of climate change. I say these are nice and laudable ideas you have shared with us. Thank you very much for your submission.
Yes, thank you. I can see that Elizabeth is back. Elizabeth, can you speak now?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay,
hello.
perfect. Do you want me to repeat your question, or you already have it?
You can repeat it, please.
Good, great. All right. So your question is the following. As an advocate of grassroots youth, women, people with as an advocate of grassroots youth, women, people with disabilities, and other displaced groups facing the impact of climate change, what are the major challenges that confront this group in climate resilience, and what recommendations can you propose?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. Basically, my recommendations are, we need to work with the communities. We need to work with the grassroots peoples, because at the end of the day, these are the frontliners of climate change, right? And in most cases, what is happening is when we are developing these policies, we develop them in our offices and we do not even take time to consult the most people that are actually being affected by this crisis. At the end of the day, if it rains, they are the first ones whose crops are going to be flooded, whose animals are going to be affected by different pests of diseases. So it's always good to take a step further to make sure that when we're crafting these policies, they are engaged in all the processes. And also the other thing is some of the languages that are in our policies is too technical, right? And when we go to these communities, we don't even put an effort to simplify this information to them so that they understand what exactly is going on or what exactly are we talking about, which is more like a communication barrier. So it is very important that when we go to the communities, we do have experts that are within the communities. If I'm talking about experts, you don't necessarily have to go to school, graduate with a master's degree to be called an expert. Because so long you have been in the space for quite some time and so long you have an experience, I feel like you do qualify to be an expert. So we have an issue and a component of indigenous knowledge systems within our communities, which we have really failed, our generation has really failed to integrate the indigenous knowledge systems and the scientific evidence or information that we have gathered to make sure that we try by all means to tackle all this information. I think when we get into these communities, these are the resource people or the resource persons that we actually have to use or we need to work with to make sure that they help us to simplify this information to the people in a way that people will understand, because they are used to their elders, they are used to seeing them, they are used to them telling them that you need to do this, this is how you have to plant your crops, this is how you can save or protect your animals from A, B, C, and D diseases. So I think this is all I have to say, and also just a challenge to the grassroots youth that sometimes information will not come to you. Sometimes we also have to take that step to at least, look for that information. Go to your nearest local offices, the rural offices, ask for certain information. Whenever you get the opportunity, even if you don't have a phone, a smartphone that goes on WhatsApp, but even reading a book or some newspapers, it actually helps you to understand what is currently happening in your country. So it's also a two-way thing. So it's not a way of us making sure that the communities are on board, but it's also the young people that are in the rural communities that they also need to have that energy and that zeal to reach out to their next government offices to look for information so that they are up to speed. Because if they keep on waiting, these people will never even go to their communities. But if they show the zeal and the skills, whenever we call and we say, oh, we want young people that are in the farming or in the agricultural space, they're the first people who will be recommended. So it's actually easier that way. So yeah, that's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for sharing, for your contribution. And let's see. So we can go to Natalie Mukundani. John, you want to go?
Okay. So Natalie, this is your question. Youth and other vulnerable groups are the most affected by climate change impacts. Having worked with the African Union Commission on Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation, what kind of partnerships and investments are required with the youth, women, and persons with disability so as to reduce their vulnerability to climate change impacts, rather increase their resilience capacity? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, John. And I love the fact that in this discussion, these youth vulnerable groups are not forgotten. Unfortunately, they're usually forgotten, and not by wanting to or by default, but because they do not have a voice. Being with organizations that I've been with, we have a feminist COP happening next month in Namibia. And one of the questions I asked the ladies were, okay, we have a feminist COP, but I don't see any gentleman invited to the feminist COP. And we're talking about how women can be better helped or equipped to address the climate change process. One of the ladies said, what are you talking about? How come you didn't say there's no woman in the man panel or there's no woman in the... So when we have our thing as women, why is it such a big deal? And it was so sad to hear that, because I understood where they're coming from. They're coming from a history whereby women are not included in things. And even when they are, it's come to a situation where they're just put there as flowers. They're put there so that they can tick off a box, not because they have valuable contribution to add. So I feel that that's a good start. Let the flowers be there. And then slowly by slowly, we'll get those who actually have something to add, if that's how they choose to see it. So what's my take? Policy. Policy, policy, policy. I love what Kenya has done with the gender rule. There has to be a representation of women in parliament. Whether you think they're fit, whether you think they'll do the job, we don't care. Let there be a woman, and then they will learn on the job. I mean, men have been in these positions for years. They didn't wake up knowing how to be politicians, no. They didn't wake up knowing how to be leaders, no. They've learned from the job. So I feel if we get into a mind space where a workforce has to have a youth with disability, okay, it doesn't have to be a youth, any person with disability, a company has to at least employ, let's say if it's a company with 500 employees, 5 people with disabilities. Surely, they can't fail to find 5 people with disabilities that have the capacity to meet, some of their work demands. So if we start with such policies where we include women, we include people with disabilities, we include young people, that would make a tremendous, tremendous impact. That's the first thing, policies that allow these people into such spaces to also hear their voices. You would be so heartbroken and amazed at the stories these people have. When you sit down and hear the story of a woman in Turkana, who lives in a desert, having to wake up every morning to carry a big pot of water for her family so that her children can go to school, because the government, inefficient leaders, inefficient policies have not put a borehole close enough to make her life as a mother, her life as a wife easier. It's just so sad. When you hear stories of a young person, very intellectually capable, but because he does not have the means to work, he's shunned by companies, because whenever he puts his CVs and mentions I'm a youth with disabilities, or whenever there's a conference and you have a participant with disabilities, you have to incur more costs in terms of hotels and air tickets. So most conference organizers just shun those people. It is so, so heartbreaking, because disability is not inability. So the first thing is policies that allow these people into the spaces. And then secondly, share their stories. I feel like the more the world hears about what these people are going through, the more they will resonate with them. Right now, you can count how many of us on this panel know a person with disability offhand. Like if I tell you, go to your phone book, call me a person with disability. Is it because you do not know who they are, or you just choose not to engage? Let's say you go to a workshop, you even introduce yourself. Hi, I'm Natalie. What's your story? Like, to tell me about yourself. So I feel like if we open up conversations and let people know what these people are going through, it will let people know that disability is not inability. Having female genitalia does not mean you're incapable of doing certain things, and to help them see these people in another light. The other thing is investment. We need investment in technology. We need investment in research, because I feel like the onset of Zoom has made life so tremendous to include such women. As I told you, we're having, I've interacted in spaces whereby you find there's a woman at a grassroots level. She couldn't travel, but at least there's an option of her to join via a Zoom call and share her story. Just participate in a space and also see what other people are doing. Technology has really helped bridge the gap. We still have a long way to go, but so far so good. And then also technology in a way that we need to devise systems and ways people with disability can easier access spaces, so that airlines don't have to charge extra, hotels don't have to charge extra, just because someone has a disability. These things should be secondhand nature, so that they're not seen as aliens, but they're seen as human and part of us. I believe with those 3 adjustments, inclusivity of women and people with disability plus youth would go a long way towards alleviating the climate change disaster. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalie. Disability is not inability. So I also love the fact that you talked about an enabling policy environment that deliberately includes and involves these vulnerable groups. You also talked about the fact that we need to open up the conversation about inclusivity or social inclusion of these groups in all our policy plannings, our implementation, and all that. Then lastly, you talked about investment in the space of technology, so that technology can bridge some of the difficulties that these groups may face in trying to access services. I think that's brilliant, and thank you for sharing that with us.
Yes, thank you very much, Natalie, for your brilliant contribution. It was very insightful. Thank you very much. And so our next intervention is going to be in French. So again, be prepared to use the interpretation tool at the bottom of your screen. So here's your question, Mr. Safi Shitsani, sorry. So in accelerating climate change adaptation actions in Africa, one key challenge to be overcome is lack of appropriate business models to support private sector investment in adaptation. As an entrepreneur yourself, what kind of business models are available to attract private sector investment in climate adaptation and in local communities in Africa? Donc, vous avez également 5 minutes pour me partager votre point de vue sur cette question.
OK, merci Elisabeth. Et en fait, pour répondre à cette question que je trouvais très pertinente et surtout très spécifique aux activités que je mène, je dirais, bon, je vais un peu accompagner ce que Chris avait parlé parce que c'est pratiquement la même thématique. Donc, quand on parle du changement climatique, en fait, c'est très vaste et c'est un coût pour l'adaptation au niveau en milieu rural. Donc, d'abord, le premier problème qu'on a, les entrepreneurs que nous sommes, nous proposons les mêmes solutions aux populations rurales et en même temps aux populations urbaines. Alors que le changement climatique affecte le plus souvent la population rurale. En fait, le taux d'impact sur la population rurale est plus élevé que le taux d'impact sur la population urbaine. Du coup, mon objectif, en fait, c'est de tirer l'intention des entrepreneurs qui proposent des solutions, de ne pas adopter les mêmes solutions pour la population rurale qu'en milieu urbain. Et il y a beaucoup de projets et des institutions qui accompagnent les jeunes entrepreneurs dans les adaptations du changement climatique ou bien ceux qui ont les idées dans le cadre du changement climatique. Mais malheureusement, ces projets n'aboutissent pas aux résultats attendus parce qu'il manque en fait le modèle économique approprié. Par exemple, on ne peut pas demander à un villageois qui à peine arrive à manger, on lui demande de payer un produit à 100 et quelques dollars. C'est un peu trop pour lui. Donc, il faut trouver un mécanisme pour adopter les modèles aux populations, au type de population. Il y a un projet dans lequel nous avons eu à travailler, c'est surtout dans le cadre de l'électrification rurale ici au Niger. Et ce projet consiste à nous, aux entrepreneurs, d'électrifier et de faire adopter la population rurale aux énergies renouvelables. Mais c'est un coût pour la population rurale. Ils ne peuvent pas oser prendre les kits solaires parce que c'est un coût très élevé. Donc, j'attire l'intention des entrepreneurs à adopter en fait, de faire des modèles économiques plus adaptés au milieu rural. Donc, le conseil que je donne, c'est de faire une économie circulaire qui permet de créer une chaîne de valeur autour de l'activité qu'on aura à mener, mais surtout de proposer des modèles qui peuvent permettre à la fois à la population rurale de pouvoir profiter des services du produit qu'on les met à leur disposition, mais surtout de régénérer des revenus autour de ces mêmes services. Donc, quand on parle de l'investissement, en fait, l'investisseur ou bien celui qui vous accompagne, il attend un retour sur ce qu'il a investi. Donc, en ce sens, il va falloir qu'on arrive à pérenniser nos activités. Et pour pérenniser les activités, il faut faire en sorte que nos consommateurs puissent en profiter des solutions qu'on met à leur disposition. Donc, en ce sens, je dirais qu'il faudrait adopter nos solutions à une économie circulaire qui permet de régénérer des revenus au fur et à mesure, à la fois pour l'entrepreneur, mais aussi pour les bénéficiaires finaux. Mais surtout, au niveau des centres incubateurs, il faudrait qu'on arrive à réfléchir aussi sur des solutions qui seront carrément différentes à la population urbaine et en même temps à la population rurale. Donc, je ne vais pas beaucoup prendre de votre temps. Je pense que je vais m'arrêter là. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Laoulani. So I'm just going to resume a little bit what Mr. Lawali said in his contribution. So basically, those were the most important points that I noticed in his contribution. And he did, in fact, mention the high cost of climate change, especially in rural area. And he mentioned the problem that most entrepreneurs kind of repeat. It's like, basically, they usually suggest the same solutions in urban and rural areas, which should be different as the realities and the purchasing power are different. So as a solution, he, basically, I really appreciated the fact that he mentioned that we should find adapted mechanisms specific to local population, find economic models and circular economies that are also adapted to our own realities. And one of the solutions that I really appreciated during his contribution was the fact that he mentioned that entrepreneurs should make sure that the solutions that they are suggesting or proposing to the population or the community, they should make sure that those solutions are sustainable, because we are looking for long-term return, long-term impact. So those solutions should be sustainable. So thank you again, Mr. Lawali. Merci beaucoup, Mr. Lawali, pour votre intervention. C'était vraiment, vous nous avez vraiment beaucoup informé sur les réalités au Tchad, les réalités que vous rencontrez en tant qu'entrepreneur et quelques solutions que vous suggérez à vos camarades entrepreneurs également. Donc, merci pour cela. So, John, you may proceed with Mr. Olumide's question.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Olumide. So, Mr. Olumide, your question is, community-based adaptation measures have proven to be successful in helping local communities mitigate against climate change impact on their lives. As an advocate of climate-smart generation in Nigeria and across the African continent, what are some key lessons and challenges you will share in planning and designing climate-smart programs at the community level in Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much, colleagues, friends. I'm sure that everybody have actually made a very key position for African, community. And I think from what I'm going to be sharing, basically, we all know that one of the two major key problems we are facing in Africa is the global poverty and the fighting against climate change. And when we look at the rural community, we see that they are actually, vulnerable. And if we fail one, then we fail others. That is something that is very, very key in this conversation. So I just want to make some key points here to say that one of my Nigerian brother have also mentioned something around access to climate finance, which is one of the driven action that can help us to drive our planning and design across Africa. And I think it's something that's going to be very important for our rural community to also see how they can invest or gain access to financing to develop or to plan and design the action that we want to see in different communities. And I can also mention that some of the key areas we need to start looking at as individuals to improve or to plan and design a community that is just and that is accessible is for us to start looking at how can we improve community resilience and adaptive capacity. Is very, very key for us to start looking at how can we also promote sustainable transportation for access for farmers, access for children going to school, and to also help them to see how they can support innovative technology that can drive sustainable innovation. And we also need to start looking at how can we enhance sustainable land use. Somebody have also mentioned so many things around agriculture, agroecology, and we need to look at that because it's very, very key for our forest management. And the RED Plus, that's a project that I've been working on for some time now. I will also say that in designing and planning for this, it's also very important for us to look at how we can invest, or let me say investment in clean energy and energy efficiency for community-driven actions, because a lot of things is going on across Africa. A lot of communities are facing problems that I think it needs a very immediate action. So I will end by saying that investment in climate action, investment in community-driven, and investment in sustainable actions will continue to help us to drive a good planning and a good design, and also to see how we can build adaptive capacity for young people, for community, for women and children, and for us to have a just future for Africa. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olumide, for your brilliant ideas you shared. You spoke about climate finance, and local communities need to be aware that they need to contribute to local financing. And that was the key. So we could also link that to the earlier discussion about how to raise funding, match funding. One of the speakers spoke about how we can prepare to meet match funding requirements as a way of financing climate change. Then you also spoke about sustainable land use in rural communities and local communities. It's also one of the key things that we need to focus on. And you talk about the adaptive capacity of communities themselves. So we can link this to the fact that there is the need for information and awareness creation on climate change in rural communities so that they become very resilient and are aware about the impact. Thank you very much for sharing your brilliant ideas with us.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you. So I think all the speakers have spoken now. They've responded to the various questions. We want to give opportunity to our audience to also ask their questions. So I will pick two questions. I'll pick two questions from the audience. And once I mention your name, you kindly unmute and you repeat the question that you type into the chat box. So we'll be taking questions from Emmanuel Gift, Mulang from Malawi. Emmanuel Gift, Mulang Jenny from Malawi. If you are there, kindly unmute and repeat your question. Emmanuel Gift, please, are you there? All right. So Emmanuel Gift's question is this: what actions will be taken after this? Oh no. No, sorry. I think that question. No, I've taken a wrong question. So the question is, Emmanuel Gift's question is, are there support systems to strengthen already existing climate work in rural level? How do we connect with them? Are there support systems to strengthen already existing climate work at rural levels? And how do we connect with them? Mr. Chris, would you want to respond to this question?
The question is, we can translate.
Are there? Oh, okay.
Yes.
Elizabeth, can you?
Yes. Let me just see. Other support system. Okay. Alors, la question, ils veulent juste savoir s'il y a des systèmes de soutien pour renforcer le travail qui est déjà en train d'être fait sur le changement climatique en milieu rural. Et s'il y a des systèmes de soutien, comment est-ce que nous pouvons comment on appelle ça, se mettre en relation ou implémenter ces systèmes de soutien, entrer en contact avec ces systèmes de soutien. Vous voulez que je reprenne?
Oui, j'ai compris.
Okay.
Et en fait, les soutiens, ça existe, mais surtout, ça existe au niveau international actuellement. Au niveau local, surtout dans notre pays, vraiment, ça n'existait pas. Des fois, on essaie un peu, la majorité, on essaie un peu de participer sur des appels au concours, à projets, par exemple avec Youth Adapt, organisé par GCA, et avec la Banque africaine de développement. Et il y a aussi Water Energy for Food. Eux aussi, c'est une organisation, c'est toujours international. Je pense que jusque-là, c'est au niveau international qu'on essaie un peu d'apporter des soutiens dans le sens d'adaptation. Mais au niveau local, au niveau gouvernemental ici, surtout en RDC, chez nous, ce n'est pas vraiment pris en charge actuellement. Donc, je vous invite, je vous invite à plus s'informer au niveau international et par rapport à plusieurs opportunités de financement de financement des projets qui cadrent avec tout ce qui est changement climatique.
Okay. Thank you very much for your response. I think I will direct this questions to this response to Elizabeth. Should we expect cycles of winter and summer in Africa in the coming years if we don't act now? This is an interesting question. Should we expect cycles of winter and summer in Africa in the coming years if we don't act now? Elizabeth, would you want to respond to this question? Okay, if Elizabeth is not there.
Or anyone,
okay.
or anyone from the panel can jump in. Yeah.
Yes, please. Should we expect cycles of winter and summer in Africa in the coming years if we don't act now? Any of the speakers want to respond to this question? All right.
Bon, je vais essayer. Okay, I'm going to try to respond to this question, but I'm going to respond in French so that my fellow Francophone will understand my view, my opinion about it. Bon, je dirais en fait, compte tenu du changement climatique et du cycle, précisément ici en Afrique, au Sahel, on voit un changement de cycle, surtout au niveau de la pluviométrie. Il y a à l'époque, la saison de pluie commence un peu plus tôt, mais ces dernières années, on se rend compte que la saison de pluie commence un peu tard et des fois, la durée elle est encore longue. Donc, je ne dirais pas qu'on aura en fait l'automne et le printemps comme en Europe, mais ce qui est sûr, on sera à un certain niveau où le cycle sera complètement changé et ce n'est pas en fait ce qu'on a l'habitude de rencontrer ici en Afrique. Donc, je parle de l'exemple du Sahel et la désertification ne fait qu'avancer. Il fut une année même aussi au Niger, dans le désert, une partie du désert où il y a beaucoup de montagnes. Il y a eu un moment où il y a eu des gouttelettes de neige, ce qui est très rare ici au Niger. Et ça a entraîné des morts des oiseaux et même des humains. Donc, je me dis que le changement est en train de changer aussi, le temps, le climat. C'est quelque chose qui peut arriver aussi si on ne prend pas les dispositions à temps et au bon moment. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Mr. Olumide, you want to weigh in? Or Mr.
All right.
Eribo, yeah, any one of you can weigh in on that same question.
Okay. All right. So Elizabeth, I think there's another question here. I want to, Dr. Nicholas Adai-Mensah from Ghana. Please, if you are there, can you unmute your mic and ask your question? Dr. Nicholas.
John,
okay.
I don't know whether you can hear me. Am I audible?
Yes,
I can't turn on my camera.
You are.
Thank you very much, John. It's been a very wonderful session on how we can build community resilience as we adapt through this climate change. Because I'm coming from the health aspect, I just want to find out whether the adaptation strategy for climate resilience, especially in Africa, because we are the most vulnerable, how is community-based initiative strengthening our healthcare system? I just want to find out whether your panelists came across any initiative, community-based initiative, that is strengthening our health system to be able to respond to the adaptation or contribute to the adaptation to build a resilient system. I don't know whether you get the question. So we need to adapt in response to climate change. In terms of the community engagement, in terms of community initiative, how is it contributing to preparing our healthcare system to be able to also move in that direction to contribute to the climate change adaptation? Thank you. I don't know if my question is clear.
Thank you. Thank you. So, do you have any of our speakers who can share some lessons on this? How our adaptation measures is preparing our healthcare system.
Can I?
Yes, please. You can.
OK. En fait, je préfère toujours donner l'exemple de mon pays et les expériences qu'on a eues. Ici au Niger précisément, dans le cadre du changement climatique, il y a plusieurs ONG internationales et les ONG locales qui interviennent dans ce sens. J'ai eu à participer à plusieurs projets de l'adaptation du changement climatique, précisément les techniques de formation au RNA, régénération assistée des terres. Donc, par rapport à cela, les ONG accompagnent les groupements et les coopératives agricoles à pratiquer les techniques de régénération assistée pour en fait pallier le problème de la désertification, mais surtout pour récupérer les terres de culture. Donc, en ce sens, ils travaillent aussi avec l'État et le groupement de jeunes pour pouvoir former plus de jeunes dans le domaine et former des pères éducateurs qui, quand les ONG vont se retirer, ils vont encore former d'autres jeunes pour pouvoir pratiquer ces techniques au fur et à mesure sur plus de superficie. Merci.
Merci infiniment, Monsieur Lawali, pour votre intervention. Et encore une fois, merci d'avoir accepté de nous joindre et de partager vos avis avec nous. Sans plus tarder, puisqu'on a longuement discuté, on a longuement entendu vos propositions, on va certainement passer maintenant à la conclusion. Donc, vous et Monsieur Chris, je l'ai dit en français parce que vous allez être les prochains à juste conclure le panel en 1 minute, si vous avez quelques conclusions à dire en quelques minutes. So I was just saying that we are about to conclude our panel. I was just asking our first speakers to conclude in 1 minute and to give their closing remarks, I would say. And the English speakers will also follow. Oui, vous pouvez y aller, que ce soit M. Sami Lawali ou M. Chris, vous pouvez conclure en 1 minute.
Alors, je vais y aller avant que Chris ne soit prêt. Bon, moi, pour conclure, je dirais qu'il faudrait qu'on amène l'État, les entrepreneurs et même tous les acteurs qui interviennent dans le cadre de l'adaptation au changement climatique à investir encore plus les moyens, surtout dans le cadre agricole, parce que c'est le premier secteur qui est beaucoup impacté par le changement climatique, afin de changer nos manières de faire, nos pratiques agricoles, de faire en sorte que l'agricole soit plus durable et faire en sorte qu'on soit en fait, qu'on donne de la valeur au secteur agricole, que le secteur agricole ne soit pas une activité de subsistance, mais plutôt une activité de développement. Merci.
Moi aussi, je peux conclure ceci en disant que moi, qu'on essaie un peu de multiplier ce genre de sessions de communication entre les jeunes, parce que la jeunesse, c'est la majorité de l'Afrique. C'est une fois, il y a plus de jeunes qui s'investissent dans des solutions, dans tout ce qui est adaptation du changement climatique. Je pense que là, on va avoir des résultats rapides, mais aussi créer de l'emploi et aussi créer de la richesse. C'est pourquoi je lance un message aux jeunes. Là où il y a plus de défis, c'est là où il y a la richesse, c'est là où il y a l'innovation. Donc, peu importe les problèmes, on va y aller et on va réussir. En bref, je vous félicite et je vous encourage aussi d'apporter plus de solutions dans les secteurs, surtout le secteur agricole. C'est le secteur qui est plus impacté et c'est le secteur qui peut atténuer aussi et à tout ce qui est problème de changement climatique facile. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Mr. Odumide, your closing remarks, please. Or Mr. Erid. I don't think you're here. Okay, Mr. Eribo, yes, you can go.
Yes. Thank you very much. So final thoughts. We heard a lot about about what we need to do within the agricultural space, which is valid. I mean, because it's one of the most threatened areas within this context of climate change and its impacts. But I think it's also important to look at the complementary side, of the built environment, because I mean, we all live in buildings. This conversation for all of us is happening within buildings. And of course, as I mentioned, that the built environment, has the greatest potential to contribute to mitigating the, to meeting the climate targets that were set in 2015, at the least cost. I think it's important for governments around Africa to take a good look at this and try to come up with more sort of integrated solutions. So for instance, when you're looking at agriculture, and you're talking about agriculture, you're talking about youth, how do you get youth into agriculture? How do you make agriculture attractive to youth? Because now it's a lot easier to be a social influencer, social media influencer, to be on TikTok, to work in a bank, these things are more attractive. So how do you then make agriculture attractive to youth? If you told young people that, okay, we have these designated agricultural areas that we're going to develop, and that's within these designated, agricultural zones, there will be accommodation provided for you. So you can own a home within this sort of zone, this area. And then that home is sort of tied to your agricultural productivity. So as you're producing on the farm and you're generating income from the farm, that money is helping you to pay towards your mortgage, on that home. And so you then find a convergence, of approaches where you are addressing the issue of agriculture and also addressing the issue of housing. And this sort of reinforce each other in terms of increasing economic growth and productivity. And so within that same space, you will also be looking at how you're doing storage, because of course, we know that one of the biggest issues with agriculture in Africa is with waste. Agricultural waste. So how are you storing, how are you processing, how are you, moving up the value chain, the agricultural value chain with your produce. So there needs to be that integrated approach, where all of these things are taken together, as one pack. And of course, this also makes it easier to raise the financing, because one of the biggest issues with financing, if you go to any lender, any borrower, the most important thing that they want to look at, that they want to see is the exits. Where is the exit for us? If we give you this money, how is this money coming back to us? How are you going to pay us back? So when you don't have a solution, when you're developing projects that show a clear exit, that if you're going to lend money to do housing projects, you are showing, where the income is coming from, to pay for those homes. So we must take sort of a mixed bag approach, to these problems in Africa. And so, this will be my, my final comments, as we say, goodbye on this very important discussion. And I hope that, it won't just end at the level of the discussion, that we can have practical steps, as someone asked, from the audience, to take these discussions forward in terms of, actions that we can then take within our respective countries and communities, in order to coalesce, this movement, towards achieving or increasing adaptation capacity, for African communities across the continent. Thank you.
John, you may conclude.
All right, so we want to have all the speakers give their concluding remarks. All right, so we want to take this opportunity to thank all our speakers, our distinguished speakers, for making time to share with us their lessons and knowledge that they have in terms of climate resilience. I wish you all the best in your endeavors. To our audience, we also want to thank you for making time to participate in this important discussion. And like was said, we should all go back and then practically put all these things into practice. We want to acknowledge the African Development Bank and then the Korea Africa Economic Cooperation as partners, and the Youth Alliance for Leadership and Development in Africa, YALDA, for putting this together. And we say we wish you all the best in your endeavors. Thank you and bye-bye.
Can we turn on our camera to take a group picture, please? And just smile. All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I don't know, is it okay now for the technical support? Is it okay? The picture is taken?
Yes, I've taken a picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you
so
all
much for
taking
joining.
part.
All right, then,
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Ciao.